And now we'll get into the substance of today's discussion, and I'll be introducing our first keynote speaker. Of course, the topic for today is trafficking in persons in times of crisis, and this is a live online briefing and consultation organized in partnership with IOM, with Caritas, and in support of the World Humanitarian Summit consultation process, and of course hosted by us here at PHAP. So I'll begin now. Our program today is in essentially three parts. We're going to begin with a special presentation, as I mentioned, by Dr. Grazia Giammarinaro, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Then we'll move into a set of presentations based on very recent work on the part of both IOM and Caritas. And then in the final portion, we will have our panel available to address questions that are coming in live by all of you who are participating live today, combined with a participants consultation. So there will be a combination of Q&A with the panel simultaneously with poll questions to get the input of all of you as participants. So beginning now with our introduction of the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons. Dr. Giammarinaro was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, in June 2014. From March 2010 until February 2014, she was the Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. In this position, she hosted the Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons, a platform for consultation and cooperation, including UN agencies, international organizations, and NGOs. She served from 2006 until 2009 in the European Commission's Directorate General for Justice, Freedom and Security in Brussels, where she was responsible for combating human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. She drafted the EU Directive on Preventing and Combating Trafficking in Human Beings and Protecting its Victims, and she has been a judge since 1991 and currently serves as a pretrial judge at the Criminal Court of Rome. And so with that, I'm going to pass the floor to the Special Rapporteur and thank her very much for giving us the honor of being with us today. And please, your introductory remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you, although I'm not very good with the technologies and I have also a problem with my connection. So I hope that everything will be okay. But I see how many people are following this webinar, and I'm very happy to say that this is very good news, because we need to address this relatively new area of anti-trafficking action. Actually, as you know, I'm reporting twice a year to the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations on the protection of the rights of trafficked persons and also people at risk of being trafficked, and people that are presumed to be trafficked but are not recognized as such by authorities. Unfortunately, there is a huge gap between the estimated scale of trafficking and identified and assisted victims. This is a general problem, a general issue concerning trafficking, which is particularly exacerbated when conflicts or crisis situations occur. This is something that I decided to identify as a priority of my mandate. It is very clear to all people dealing with trafficking, but also to people dealing with conflict and crisis situations, that trafficking is associated with this situation. But so far, trafficking has been considered a sort of side phenomenon. What is new, and I would like to underline that the two reports issued by IOM and Caritas we presented um, a few days ago during the Human Rights Council session exactly underline this, that trafficking is not a side phenomenon, but it's a direct consequence of conflicts and, in general terms, crisis situations. For different reasons, we find all the contributing factors, and in particular, the vulnerability factors leading to trafficking in a situation of enormous development in crisis situations. First of all, there is a breakdown of the rule of law. Secondly, people that were already in a situation of vulnerability or marginalization, such as minorities, for example, find themselves in an even worse situation. New people that were not vulnerable before become vulnerable because they lose their jobs, they lose their homes, and of course all the social and economic factors fostering, leading to trafficking are exacerbated. Last but not least, I would like to say that the presence of different actors, such as armed groups, but unfortunately also peacekeepers, heightens the demand of sexual services, cheap labor, and in general terms, we can say that we have to look at also in these situations, at the demand side. That is one of the contributing factors. Of course, all these elements make it possible, make it probable that trafficking occurs. But so far, trafficking has not been in the picture, has not been a subject, for example, for training for people working in the field. What we want to achieve is, first of all, a better knowledge of what happens in conflict and crisis situations. But the final goal, and this is very well underlined in both the reports, is to increase the capacity of governments, people working in the field, to deal with trafficking in crisis situations and be able to identify cases, identify victims, and protect and assist people at risk and people trafficked. Of course, governments there have to play a major role because it is their obligation also in crisis situations to identify, assist, and protect victims of trafficking. Thank you.
Thank you very much for getting us started with today's important discussion with very inspiring remarks. So thank you for that. We do have a series of follow-up questions that, if I may, I would like to pose to you now before we get into the presentations from our colleagues in IOM and Caritas. The first of these questions is really to ask you to elaborate just a bit more on why trafficking in persons in times of crisis has become a priority in your mandate.
My mandate includes exploring new or relatively new areas of trafficking, because we know that trafficking is a process, is a phenomenon in rapid, that we can see quick development. Modus operandi of traffickers change. Trafficking, well, we find trafficking, we detect trafficking in new situations that were not known. We identify new forms of exploitation, or forms of exploitation that were not very well known in the past. For example, both the reports underline that sexual exploitation is always a component of trafficking in crisis situations. Even the worst forms of sexual exploitation are always involved. And for example, something that's so well known so far is that marriages can be one of the elements of the trafficking process. For example, temporary marriages are a means to deceive women and families. The family, for example, is convinced to marry a daughter, to place the daughter in a more protective environment. But in fact, this is a so-called temporary marriage, and so it is just a means to place the girl in forced prostitution. So this is a reason why I identified this a priority, especially lately during the occurrence of so many tragedies in the Mediterranean Sea, in Southeast Asia. We are aware that there is a great proportion, a big portion of migrants that flee from conflict areas, that flee from war, from persecution. And we know that these people have been already trafficked during their journey. People, for example, present in camps in Libya have already been exploited sometimes, or some of them are aware that they are going to be sold into severe forms of exploitation, simply because they are indebted, simply because traffickers have deprived them of their belongings. So I felt as a duty, as my duty, to deal with this issue more extensively and more effectively.
Excellent, thank you very much. And as for another follow-up question, I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on why you think that trafficking in times of crisis has so far not received the due attention during crisis that it deserves as a challenge.
I think that, as I said, there is no awareness of the deep link between trafficking and crisis. So far, this has been sometimes, a matter of, declaration. We can hear such a statement that trafficking is linked with crisis situations, but so far the phenomenon didn't have the attention it deserves. So this is one of the reasons. Another reason is, of course, in crisis situations there are so many priorities. But my point is to protect people from trafficking is one of the high priorities in crisis situations. So our joint efforts should be to make it clear that trafficking is a priority as any other priority, because it is a matter of death or life. For many trafficked persons, it is very much like this.
Great, thank you very much. And you mentioned a few examples of groups particularly at risk of trafficking during crisis. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on groups that are particularly at risk in situations of crisis, and that would be either armed conflict situations or natural disaster situations.
We know that there are communities that are particularly targeted. For example, we know that Yazidi communities, Christian communities, but also Muslim communities have been targeted in Iraq, in Syria. We know that Boko Haram kidnapped girls in Nigeria. We know that there are communities that have been particularly and are particularly at risk. But this is not the only issue. We know that women and girls are sold into prostitution simply to make money by armed groups. It seems, and it comes from the reports, for example, the indication that in border areas, armed groups and criminal groups make money by smuggling and trafficking people across the borders and selling women and girls into prostitution. So of course, women and girls are particularly at risk. Children are at risk in any crisis situations, and we have seen this on the occasion of a number of natural disasters. Children, when the family lose everything, jobs are not there. There is a survival need. Children very often become primary breadwinners, but this can lead to the worst forms of exploitation, be it sexual exploitation or labor exploitation.
This conference appears to be inactive and will be ended soon. If you are the host and wish this conference to continue, please press any key on your telephone touchpad.
Problem with the connection, I think. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. I apologize for that. There's no problem with the connection, so please do continue. I apologize for the interruption.
Okay. No, I was talking about children and that particular vulnerability. Of course, we know that everybody is vulnerable in a crisis situation, but I think that training that we should promote, and I know that one of the outcome of this research action issued by Caritas, but also for IOM, the final outcome will be, among other things, training for humanitarian aid people. Of course, we have to make everybody aware of this particular vulnerabilities to better protect.
Your microphone has been turned on.
Hello?
Yes, I apologize.
Yes.
Again, there's no problem with the connection. Please do continue. I apologize for the interruption.
Okay, no, I have finished for the moment. Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I do actually have one additional question, and this, of course, it's a big one and maybe challenging, but I think very important for our listeners and participants, active participants we have with us today. They're interested to hear what are your most urgent recommendations to the international community, the donor community, and to local governments to address this issue?
My recommendation, key recommendation would be to place trafficking in the big picture of humanitarian aid. because so far trafficking has been a sort of specific, if not isolated, area of policy. On the contrary, we have to be aware that trafficking and anti-trafficking action should be absolutely connected with other related policy areas. And of course, whatever concerns development, whatever concerns humanitarian issues, we have to identify the links, and we have to identify the links between different people active in different areas that should be aware of the issues related to another related areas. I give you an example. Asylum policy and anti-trafficking action should be connected, and people working in the field of asylum should be in a position to identify indicators of trafficking, because we know very well that among asylum seekers, refugees, people fleeing conflicts, there are a number of victims of trafficking, people already trafficked, or people at high risk of being trafficked. So people dealing with trafficking should be in a position to identify vulnerability related to the process of and vice versa. People dealing with asylum, people dealing with conflict areas should be able to identify indicators of trafficking to help a process of implementation of the rights of these people.
Wonderful. And thank you again very much, Dr. Giammarinaro, for being with us today. I see that your comments and your responses to these initial questions have really inspired an interesting substantive exchange in the chat among our participants. So thank you very much for that. And I also see in the poll
unfortunately, shortly I have to leave the webinar.
Okay.
But thank you very much for this invitation and for being in a position to give you my contribution. Thank you.
Wonderful, and thanks for being with us. We look forward to the next time. So thank you. So with that, we'll now be moving to the next section of our event today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce now 3 colleagues coming to us from the International Organization for Migration, IOM. I would like to introduce now Lawrence Hart. Lawrence Hart is head of the Migrants Assistance Division at IOM. He also previously held other headquarters and field positions with the organization, having been chief of mission in Tripoli from 2006 to 2011. Lawrence has extensive expertise in various aspects of migration management, including counter-trafficking, border management, migration and development, labor migration, and emergency response. And then I'd like to introduce also at the same time 2 additional colleagues from IOM. We are pleased to have with us today Sarah Craigs, who works at IOM's regional office for the Middle East and North Africa region as Regional Migrant Assistance Specialist. She provides technical support to IOM's regional programming on migrant protection, anti-human trafficking, voluntary return and reintegration for stranded migrants in need of humanitarian response, mixed migratory flows, and assistance to other vulnerable migrants, such as accompanied minors. And importantly for us today, Sarah has supported research on human trafficking in times of crisis, which she will be presenting together with her colleague Agnes Tillenac, who I will introduce now. Agnes is also with us today here in the PHAP office, connecting from Geneva. Agnes is a consultant and counter-trafficking expert. She's been conducting research for IOM on human trafficking in times of crisis since November 2014 and has worked for IOM in a number of conflict and post-conflict settings, including during the Libya crisis of 2011. So actually, if I may, I believe I will now move to ask Lawrence to take the floor, and then I will come back to introductions and introduce our colleagues from Caritas in the next phase. So for now, I'd like to give the floor to Lawrence to provide just a brief introduction, a few minutes on why this is an important topic for IOM, and to give us an introduction then to the recent research which will be presented by colleagues Sarah and Agnes. So over to you, Lawrence.
Yep.
Okay, we may have a slight technical problem. We're just going to check on the connection, if you'll bear with us for one moment.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, hello, Lawrence. I hear you loud and clear.
Oh, great, great. Let me just first of all say thank you, Anna Harad, for organizing this event, and I'm truly happy to see so many people from different backgrounds and from different geographical areas participating to this event. Now, going back to your question, why is trafficking in person in times of crisis a priority for IOM? Well, let me say that because it has been overlooked for far too long, and as we will see in the course of this event, we can now say that evidence is now there to prove that trafficking takes place often in a larger scale proportion in the context of crisis. Now, IOM has been focusing on the provision of protection and assistance to vulnerable migrants, especially victims of trafficking, since now 1994. And since that moment till now, it has assisted approximately 76,000 victims. Now, this may seem to some like a large number, but it actually remains quite a drop in the ocean, considering that estimates of victims of trafficking around the world are very large and often inaccurate. And among the various activities that IOM conducts, we provide consistent response to needs in countries of crises. For example, since 2004, with the Indian Ocean tsunami, and through engagement in other crises, such, for example, in Haiti in 2010, up to today in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and others. We have noticed that trafficking was and remains an issue that is not properly addressed in times of crisis, as Maria Grazia Giammarinaro alluded to in her presentation. Now, this is the case for both governmental and non-governmental actors. Identifying cases of trafficking in persons in crisis is hampered by definitional difficulties, a lack of knowledge, and also the existence of gray areas between trafficking and other forms of exploitation. On top of that, trafficking in person is typically not considered as a direct consequence of the crisis, and this is a misplaced assumption, which often hampers the field response to human trafficking cases, not only in terms of documentation, also reporting, identification, and assistance to the victims, but also in the subsequent criminal investigation. Counter-trafficking efforts are not necessarily understood as immediate life-saving in an emergency situation. And in reality, these efforts are a matter of life and livelihood for the victims of trafficking, and we reckon they should be considered with as much priority as for any other crisis-affected population. And in this respect, an adequate response has to ensure the complete protection of vulnerable individuals. Therefore, any counter-trafficking activity should find a place in the existing cluster system and also be part of the overall protection approach implemented during the emergencies. So in order to identify the gaps and lessons learned from past and current crises since last November until now, IOM has just carried out a field research exploring the trafficking and its connections to armed conflicts, national disasters, and mixed flows conflict settings. And this specific research includes research in Libya and Iraq, and consultations and desk research in several parts of the world, which includes Syria, the Philippines, Haiti, Eastern Africa, and countries affected by the 2004 tsunami. So this is just to give you an idea of the breadth of the research, which will be subsequently presented by my colleagues.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lawrence. And now I'd like to give the floor to Sarah, who will begin the presentation. And Sarah and Agnes, I will leave it to the two of you to coordinate when you'll be changing from one to the other. And Chris is now putting the presentation up on the screen. So over to you, Sarah.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, and I guess good evening, depending on where in the world you're connecting in from. But it's really a pleasure and an honour to be participating in this event. So I will just start a few minutes to give some of the overall context, and then I, as was mentioned, will be handing over to my colleague Agnes, who conducted the research. So just to elaborate a little bit more on what was mentioned by my colleague Lawrence Hart, we live in a time of unprecedented, diverse, and simultaneously ongoing crises, as well as human mobility. We know that more and more people are on the move. We know that more and more people are displaced, often because of crises. And we know that more and more migrants are actually getting directly caught up in crisis. But as other speakers have actually mentioned, the specific risks and vulnerabilities of such populations to human trafficking and related forms of exploitation remains largely overlooked. So first and foremost, this study was actually commissioned to better guide our own organisational response. In 2012, IOM launched the Migrant Crisis Operational Framework, and that is an operational framework which is used to guide IOM mission states and other actors better manage all aspects of migration affected or migration impacted aspects of a crisis. Now, one specific pillar of response embedded within this migration crisis operational framework is the integration of a counter-trafficking perspective within a crisis response. So we wanted to very much elaborate on that and understand really how trafficking was playing out and other associated vulnerabilities, but as I mentioned, to provide guidance. And actually IOM's work was very much informed in a crisis response, very much in the Western Balkan context. And so as again my colleague mentioned, we really commissioned the research to first and foremost provide evidence-based findings on the incidences or risks to trafficking in broader forms of exploitation impacting mobile populations in various different crisis settings. Secondly, to formulate internal guidance to help our staff in the field and how they should be responding to addressing particular vulnerabilities in various crisis situations, but then also to provide recommendations and policy considerations for the broader international humanitarian community. We decided to base our fieldwork in the Middle East, North Africa, simply because of the impact, the complexity, the diversity of various different crises going on: Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, the protracted nature of the crises, the Mediterranean Sea context. And then the final pillar, which, and I sort of underlined that, yes, we started out with an internal impetus, but actually it really was to better formulate international community response considerations. In doing so, we were very conscious not to overstate the problem. We wanted to really understand what the forms of exploitation of human trafficking coming to light were. We wanted to understand what the consequences were, but we also wanted to avoid coming up with parallel systems. And so we really entered into the research looking looking to actually integrate or mainstream anti-trafficking responses, specifically prevention and protection initiatives, into the humanitarian response, but again, whilst ensuring that it was evidence-based. So with that, I would like to actually pass on to my colleague, who will now elaborate on some of the actual research findings.
Thank you, Sarah. So I will briefly introduce the methodology of the research that took place from November 2014 until May 2015. It consisted in a global assessment of ongoing and past crises, such as the current crisis in Iraq or in Libya. We also looked at the situation of the Syrian refugees, the Eastern African countries in light of the Sinai scenario, and the even going back to the Balkans, the crisis in the Western Balkans in the 90s. We also analyzed a number of natural disasters, such as the Asian tsunami in 2004, the Haiti earthquake in 2010, and more recently the 2013 Haiyan typhoon that hit the Philippines. Over 120 interviews were conducted, and the research was also based on IOM internal and public data collected and released since the 90s. As explained by my colleague Sarah, the aim was to gain a better understanding of the phenomenon, but also collect evidence of the manifestation of trafficking in times of crisis, to provide an analysis on the nexus between trafficking, exploitation, and crisis for the use of IOM, but also states and the humanitarian community in general. We then came to the conclusion that crises were likely to have an impact on trafficking in person and exploitation. On one hand, crisis situations can exacerbate existing vulnerabilities to and manifestations of trafficking in person. With the disruption of livelihood and the dire social and economic conditions induced by crisis, for instance, we often notice an increased reliance on negative coping mechanisms, some of them leading to trafficking in person and exploitation. We can take the example of forced or early marriage, for instance, that are on the rise among the Syrian refugee communities, or within Iraq and among the Iraqi IDPs. Crises are also likely to create a breakdown in law and order, and then see the development of criminal activities, often in total impunity, as we are seeing in the current Libyan setting. The research also came to the conclusion that new forms of trafficking were also likely to emerge in crisis setting, and in particular new forms related to new actors coming on stage. If we think about armed conflict, we will have the presence of armed groups and militias that may use trafficking and exploitation as a means to achieve their objective, financially speaking, to strengthen their logistic equipment, for instance. They may also use trafficking to provide for sexual services, bring additional workforce or fighters. Trafficking may also be used in terms of ideology, with, as we've seen in Iraq, the systematic enslavement of minorities. Other actors that may have an impact in on the trafficking trends are, as rightly mentioned by the Special Rapporteur, peacekeepers, international community members that may be deployed massively in affected countries and in post-crisis setting. These are likely to create new demand in the affected countries, in particular in terms of sexual services. Another finding is that the displacement and mobility will create additional risk factors to exploitation and trafficking. The position of vulnerability of displaced persons and migrants may be abused, and this within the countries and regions affected by crisis and also in neighboring countries. For instance, internally displaced persons and refugee camps may be seen as pool of victims for traffickers looking for a cheap or free workforce or sexual services. Persons affected by crisis may also engage into unsafe, risky migration, making them vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. All this is true following armed conflicts, natural disasters, and also maybe even more true in times of protracted crisis. So for all these reasons, trafficking persons should be considered as directly related to crisis and not only as a side phenomenon. Crises have an impact on trafficking, on the trends, on the population affected, independently for the type of crisis, natural disasters, armed conflict, or protracted setting. We also believe that trafficking in person should be documented and addressed from the onset of humanitarian responses for greater impact. This has been the case in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake, and more recently in the Philippines in 2013. By intervening from the onset of a crisis, the response may allow for better prevention, early interception of victims and traffickers. However, it appeared that despite the different manifestations that we can witness in the field, counter-trafficking was still at the margin of humanitarian response efforts. And I will give back the floor to my colleague Sarah to continue the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnes. So, so with that, what did we find particularly with regards to protection? Well, the research confirmed that there are protection gaps. Now, there is a very robust protection system in place, but what we found is that trafficking in persons in particular is a human rights violation, is a crime covered by international law, is actually unaddressed as a separate protection concern within the overall humanitarian response at a systematic and at an institutional level. Now, that's not to say that the issue is not being addressed in certain contexts, in certain countries for certain crises. For example, in a number of countries, in Libya, in Iraq, for example, this issue is being tabled, and there are specific discussions on how trafficking and onward irregular migration of mobile populations, of the exploitation risks of those populations, it is being discussed. However, we found that this is often based on local experience or knowledge of the issue, and really, as I mentioned, less so on clear requirements, on systematized, institutionalized requirements to look at this particular protection concern. So, for example, the issues of forced prostitution are taken up by the GBV cluster within the overall protection cluster response. However, in really understanding how trafficking for sexual exploitation, that being an act of someone being deliberately recruited or transferred or harbored by means of coercion or deception or other abusive forms for the actual purpose of their sexual exploitation, that is not being systematically addressed within the humanitarian response. So with that, and to begin to conclude, and this is really to echo back on what previous speakers, the Special Rapporteur herself has mentioned, but we came up with a number of specific recommendations based upon the research findings in IOM's own organisational response and our response together with our partners in the past number of years. So we very much advocate for the response to human trafficking and related abuses against vulnerable and mobile populations to be evidence and needs-based and to be context-specific. There are different crises, there are different risk factors, there are different affected populations. But as my colleague Agnes mentioned, the risks to trafficking, to broader vulnerabilities are there. We also advocate for such interventions to be considered as life-saving, a life-saving protection activity. We also have one of the recommendations is to ensure that the response to human trafficking and those border related abuses is very much operationalized and fully integrated into the humanitarian response, and that's before, during and after. We believe that should be with specific and supplementary coordination mechanisms, capacity building, awareness raising, advocacy, and working within the broad anti-trafficking response of protection, prevention and prosecution. And that should really be in terms of partnership. And we've noted a number of the comments on chat with regards to ensuring local partnerships, ensuring cross-border initiatives, ensuring partnerships amongst international agencies, and that's really critical. And so with that, finally, we believe that the response should be systematically incorporated into assessment, monitoring and funding mechanisms. So with that, on behalf of both myself and Agnes, we'd really like to thank you once again for listening in, and we look forward to the question and answers later on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, both Sarah and Agnes, for the presentation. Very interesting and yeah, useful presentation of your findings of the research. So thank you for that, and also for making us aware and focusing us, I think, on what are some very important and interesting recommendations that are coming out of the research to move things forward. So with that, I would like to move on to introduce two additional guests. We're very pleased to have with us Geneviève Collat and also Olivier Peyrou, who will be presenting another research project which has been conducted recently that we'll be hearing about today to add to the discussion. I'll begin by introducing Geneviève. Geneviève is with Secours Catholique Caritas France. She is in charge, together with Caritas Internationalis, of questions of counter-trafficking in human beings, protection of unaccompanied minors, and juvenile justice. Geneviève is the coordinator of a network which is called Together Against Trafficking in Human Beings, which gathers together 23 associations in France on prevention, public awareness, support for victims, and related activities. And she is part of the coalition and also part of the platform of civil society against trafficking, which was created by the European Commission. She was previously responsible for the Europe and Central Asia division of Secours Catholique and worked on institutional support to NGO partners and advocacy, especially in the areas of justice, peace, migration, and the fight against poverty. And then presenting together with Geneviève, we are very pleased to welcome Olivier Peyrou. Olivier is a sociologist and a legal expert on trafficking in persons. His work with child victims of trafficking, notably from the Balkans, has involved him with in-the-field consulting assignments on both local and European, Europe-wide child protection issues for national and international organizations. His research has been widely published, and he is regularly consulted by the media on trafficking and child protection issues. And to note that in addition to his nonprofit commitments to children at risk, Olivier is a legal expert on trafficking in human beings for the French judiciary. So we're now going to, give the floor first to Geneviève, who will begin the presentation, and then Geneviève, when you're ready, you can pass the floor then with the verbal cue to Olivier to continue with the further findings.
Thank you very much. We want to present trafficking in human beings related to conflict and post-conflict situation. We worked with Caritas Albania, Armenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, France, Kosovo, Lebanon, Turkey from 2 years. Why this research action? First, it's an innovative topic. After that, it's a complex topic that requires a scientific and practical approach. For us, it was very important to have these two approaches, and it's why we say it's a research action. The part of action is very important for us. This research action that requires sociologic analysis, active involvement of Caritas network and its partners. What specificity for Caritas and what positioning in respect to the international organization and other NGOs? During conflicts, these organizations do not take certain populations and persons at risk of being in a situation of trafficking into consideration enough. It's the first point. And the second point is in post-conflict, some kinds of trafficking are not of or insufficiently taken into consideration or are neglected over time. The objectives was to understand trafficking human beings in conflict and post-conflict situation, to help Caritas and its partners to more effectively support refugees and to produce new tools for this. And we want to propose a series of recommendations based on local research and trials to better address human trafficking in aid programs for conflict and post-conflict situations, and to disseminate them to local, national, regional, and international stakeholders. Concerning the methodology, we collect information in each country. It's important for us to have some very concrete possibility to see the question by field observations, interviews with field NGOs and relevant organizations, semi-structured interviews with victims and transcription, geographical origin, family ties, and report and study on the topic. Olivier, you can continue.
Hi. So I will give you some, some findings about this research. The idea, perhaps, it's to have some preliminary remarks. What we notice in this research, it's the process of exploitation and trafficking is starting at the beginning of the crisis. It's not something that is starting 2 years or 3 years after. It's starting at the beginning of the crisis. This is the first point. The second point is affected the countries who are in war, but also the countries who are neighbors. So we have a lot of refugees who are also in situation of trafficking. And this is the last point of these preliminary remarks. We noticed that in some countries like Bosnia, Kosovo, where the war is over from many years now, trafficking is still ongoing because there was not a real work on that. So for certain minorities or certain vulnerable groups, trafficking is still ongoing because there is no consideration by most of the organization on this issue. So it's an important point. Now I will switch about, the some different findings. As the Rapporteur Special said, we find that the marriage, weddings, are very used for purpose of trafficking. But what it's important to say before, it's most of the time the parents, they think that they have no other option to protect their daughter, to send them for a marriage. So most of the time they just contact some go-between. If they know that there are some risks, but they say we don't have other option, so we can send our daughter. Perhaps she will be protected, perhaps no. So this is in a way the mentality that Caritas Lebanon and Turkey find on the field work. And after we have different forms of exploitation by those early marriage. Sometimes it could be just domestic exploitation. Sometimes it could be sexual exploitation. So it depends. And we have also this temporary marriage, but because the reporter yes told before about it, so I think it's not necessary to insist so much on that. But it's very important to understand that now it's a main way to exploit some girls. So I will pass a little bit about the economical exploitation. So what we notice, it's in all those countries where Caritas or the Caritas did the field work, we saw that we have a lot of economical exploitation. Most of the time, economical exploitation is considered as something separated from the other form of exploitation. And what we saw, it's in different cases, this exploitation start by economical, and after some women they are victims of harassment, and so by this way they are sometimes recruited for sexual exploitation. For the men, some of them they said that the people ask for them to sell drugs or to transport some drugs. It was the case, for instance, in Armenia. So it's important to say that even if everybody is aware about there is a lot of economical exploitation, it doesn't mean that it will remain the only form of exploitation. So yeah, yeah, I try to move. Okay, yes, about children exploitation. In all those countries where you have a lot of refugees, in the field there are a lot of children in the street or in the agriculture work. And also what it's important to say, it's most of those children, they were attending school in their country. It's important to say that it's not a normal situation. Those children were begging, they were not begging in their countries. And Caritas Lebanon made a very important study about more than 2,000 children from Iraqi were in the street in Lebanon. And one of the results it was that 92% of those children, they were attending school and they were not in the street in Iraq. So just because of this situation that they are exploited. And we also notice that in some camps, like private camp, like we can find in Jordania, in Lebanon, and so on, sometimes you have a kind of traditional chief. The name is Shawish. With the go-between, and so this guy is renting a field where those family put their tents. They is renting from, for instance, from Lebanon owners or some from the other owners, and after give some taxes to all the families. And most of the time also he organize in the same time the job, from he said that those family and those children, they have to work in this agriculture field and so on. And what we notice is most of the time the humanitarian organization, they just use and they just address the request to this person, this shawish, for for the food or for giving a blanket to all the refugees. And by this way, they just give a kind of empowerment of his position, and so it's easier for him to exploit those families who are in his camp. So this is it's a we have to highlight this point because we observe that in the field. And so Okay. And yes, to go, sorry. Yes, what we saw about vulnerable minorities, like the IOM pointed out, for sure, people are, yes, because they are coming from some minorities like Dom, Christian, Yazidi, Kurds, they can be exploited more. What we saw, what we compare with Bosnia and Kosovo, is those minorities, even after the war, they still are, as vulnerable groups. So it's very important to work at the beginning, but also in the midterm and in the long term with those minorities, because if we don't do that, it's a very big risk of exploitation for 2 or 3 generations in some cases. And just to conclude, what we saw is smuggling, migrant smuggling, and trafficking in human beings. Most of the time, they are considered as 2 different categories. And in this research, we saw that most of the migrants, they need to have some debts. They need to pay their to the smugglers. They need to pay to for changing, for going to their countries of destination and transit country and so on. So they need to pay for the border, but sometimes they have some debts, and because they have some debts, there are you have these smugglers. They just turn in like traffickant, and they force them to commit some petty crimes to transport some drugs, or they just force them to make sexual exploitation too. So this is why the border between smuggling and trafficking is not very clear in this issue of conflict and post-conflict situation. I think I will stop here because it's good if we can have some questions. And so thank you for
Excellent. Thanks very much to both of you, Geneviève and Olivier, for your presentation. So we'll now move to the Q&A portion, and I'll just begin by announcing, and this is for the benefit primarily of our speakers today so that we can expect. I will be going through in the following order with the rounds of questions. So first I will go to Lawrence. Then I will go to Sarah and Agnes. And I hope that this might give Sarah and Agnes an opportunity to coordinate quickly amongst themselves which questions they would each like to address. So I'll go Lawrence, then Sarah, then Agnes, then to Olivier, and then to Geneviève, and again with the hope that Olivier and Geneviève, being in the same location, may be able to coordinate between themselves which questions they will pick up. So with that, I will present, I actually have a series of questions. I've been here busily trying to organize the different questions that have come in live during the presentations, and I've organized them into 4 main questions for this round, bringing together a number of different inputs. So first is a question regarding the root cause of the problem. So this is coming in from a number of different participants. I'll just pick one coming from Trevor that reflects, I think, the question of several people. How can we deal, or can we deal, actually with the root cause of the problem? What makes people want to be involved in trafficking, and to what extent can we focus on the cause versus being reactive in the way that we're using our resources? Another formulation of the question would be looking specifically in the case of, this is Lul participating from the UK and wondering about the case of Eritrea. Why is there almost nothing being done about the root cause? What are the main barriers to addressing the problem at its root? So that's question number one, coming from a number of participants regarding the root cause of the problem and the relative use of resources and attention on addressing the cause versus response. Second is a question coming in from Emily in Australia. Emily writes, during emergencies, when the mandated agencies are usually overburdened and at times resistant to combating trafficking, and the government is often complicit, how would you recommend, or what would you recommend are the best ways to prevent trafficking from a disaster management or community perspective, given that the cluster system does not necessarily effectively coordinate the partners on the ground? So that was the second question, which is regarding disaster management or community perspective responses, given some concern on the part of Emily and other participants about the effectiveness as the cluster system to coordinate on this particular kind of response. Then we also had a couple of questions. So this is our third question in the series regarding specifically situations of armed conflict. So I'll take the example of the question from Lindsay. Lindsay is asking, how can we identify and assist victims in crisis zones, in particular situations of armed conflict, where it's not safe to move around, where there is no central government to work with, no law enforcement? Really a practical question when it comes to response, specifically in a situation of armed conflict. What is an effective way for responders to deal with a challenging situation on the ground in that type of situation? And then finally, fourth question here. So this is coming in from Sean, a question: how can we elevate this issue to a higher level of concern so that all actors, donors, military, governments, etc., in the crisis situation are sensitive to the issues and working together to prevent trafficking and protect vulnerable populations? So really about advocacy, I think, is a term that has come up previously in the presentations and recommendations, but really how can the issue be elevated practically speaking? So that was quite a load of questions to put on you. But as mentioned, I will start with Lawrence. And Lawrence, feel free to pick up 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of those questions as you prefer, and then we'll go through in the order that I mentioned. And for everyone on the panel, please feel free to pick up on the issues or questions in which you are best positioned to respond. So first to Lawrence.
Okay, can you hear me first of all?
Yes, I hear you well now, thanks.
Okay, good. No, because we had problems before. Thank you very much, and very, very interesting question. Probably would deserve each of them a session on its own. Let me touch upon very briefly, and happy to expand if there is more interest. Well, you know, going on the root causes of the problem, of course, we have to look at the need of ensuring to have education and also addressing poverty where these kind of situation of trafficking flourishes, and also to have, I would say, actors in place that are able to, even with little means, were able to address or prevent the issue. And this sort of connects to what is the best ways of preventing. I think there is an important role of the NGOs, the grassroots organization, the community level that can do, that can go quite far in terms of addressing the issues. And I also would like to raise the issue of the importance of having religious personnel properly trained. And when I say religious personnel, I mean of every religious denomination. Religious personnel is often the first go-to institution or persons that people would go to, and often perhaps seeking for food or for shelter, but not necessarily the religious personnel are tooled or capable of understanding, for example, the complexity of or the category of the migrant that they have in front. The migrant that they have in front could be a person just in need of economic support. In other cases, it can be an asylum seeker. In other cases, it can be a minor. In other cases, it can be a victim of trafficking. So how do we enable people, religious personnel and NGOs, to have a knowledge of these categories? Because the first and immediate response is capital. We need to have people who are able to refer to the right institutions those victims of trafficking that come across. And so the other important actor in place, of course, is the law enforcement, because those are the actors who actually can crack down on traffickers, but also to have a judicial, which is a judiciary, so judges and prosecutors that are able to address the issue quickly. So connecting these actors, NGOs, judges and prosecutors and law enforcement is of capital importance. In fact, this is what I'm saying is a little bit of a model in some countries, because they constitute what is so-called national referral mechanisms. So it's important to have a national referral mechanism in place. And then there is another problem when it comes to dealing with trafficking. We have to look, for example, that there may be people who are criminals who engage in trafficking, but some people may be induced towards trafficking. And I think the UN Special Rapporteur quickly mentioned this during her intervention. There is for many people, when you lose, for example, in the aftermath of a natural disaster or during an armed conflict, if you lose your income, you also are becoming no longer the breadwinner of the family, and that represents a loss of identity. And that needs also to be looked upon, to how to prevent people who would normally never engage into trafficking activities, not to become traffickers and perpetrators themselves. How to elevate this issue? Well, first of all, I think what is important is to bring evidence on the table. As was mentioned, up till now, there was more anecdotes rather than evidence. In our work, but not only exclusively in IOM's work, we come across people who are victims of trafficking, but there is no systematic data collection or systematic information collection that enables to address the issue or bring it higher up. So this is another important element that needs to be put forward. How much is in fact trafficking flourishing during crisis settings? Because then this would probably raise the attention and would not relegate counter-trafficking activities to a generic protection bag where all sorts of vulnerabilities are collected. So I would leave it at that for the time being.
Great, thank you very much. And moving now to Sarah, we'll be unmuting your microphone now and giving you the floor.
Thank you very much. Well, incredibly interesting and pertinent questions, and really they're all extremely critical points. And again, we've been keeping an eye on the chat and see that a lot more content is coming up there. Maybe actually, if I can just say, because we didn't mention it during our presentation, the research, we have the briefing document in summary form available, and there will be a longer research paper available. But we do very much welcome any suggestions, any specific recommendations. So please, please do keep the feedback coming. My colleague Agnes is going to touch upon the issue of root causes. I'll just further add to what Lawrence mentioned on the other 2 points. I mean, particularly regarding the first question around the system, the immediate response system already being highly overburdened, then we fully agree, and that's why we very much underline the fact that we're not trying to set up new mechanisms, where we're really trying to integrate into existing mechanisms. What we've seen very much with counter-trafficking interventions, though, is that the Palermo Protocol is very widely ratified. We know that there is significant counter-trafficking programming being undertaken by states, by NGOs, by INGOs, by international actors. So there is actually a foundation to already start from, and we very much need to actually build upon that that foundation and take very much a grassroots approach to that as well. With regards to the particular constraints in armed conflict, and again, this is an extremely critical issue, and one which very much impacts upon access. And we as IOM, but the broader response community have continually confronted by this in a number of crises, armed or environmental, going on at present. And I think here it did come up on the chat as well, but I think here the importance is very much on referral pathways and ensuring that actually frontline responders do have basic information. And actually, to give some examples, IOM's been undertaking a lot of capacity building with frontline responders, be they humanitarian staff, be they staff who are involved in distributing non-food items, for example, be they medical staff, be they immigration officers, law enforcement officials, where we can still work with state authorities. I do need to put that caveat there, but we've been investing a lot in actually providing capacity building on the basic response to identification and their referral to assistance in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Libya, and still actually in Syria as well. Just to finally conclude on the issue of advocacy and ongoing efforts, I mean, there two organisations today have presented research. We also heard from the Special Rapporteur. We know that other organisations and academic entities are undertaking research on this issue. It's not the responsibility of one actor, and it's not just the responsibility of humanitarian actors or development actors. It's the collective responsibility of us all. Actually, in the run-up to this webinar, IOM and Caritas, with the support of the Special Rapporteur, presented our research findings in the outskirts of the 29th Human Rights Council, and there the Special Rapporteur Maria Grazia Giammarinaro raised the issue in plenary at the Human Rights Council. So there her advocacy role as the UN entity, the Special Rapporteur on human trafficking, is critical. And I know she's no longer on the line, but we were extremely appreciative of her support. I'll leave it at that, but yeah, thank you once again for the interesting questions.
Great, thank you. And now I believe we're moving to Agnes. Are you on the line? Great.
I'm online, thank you.
Okay, good.
Just to add, thanks. Just to add a few words regarding the root causes. A number have already been mentioned, but I would like to stress a few additional points, in particular regarding aggravating risk factors, and in particular discrimination. Discrimination can be found at the beginning of an important number of trafficking cases. Discrimination can be gender-based in many aspects, but discrimination can also be related to ethnic, racial, religious, social factors. And this is very much true and important when talking about trafficking in person, and in particular in crisis setting. Another important factor is the absence of suitable durable solutions, or immediate solutions at least, in a number of crisis settings. That will then push people to adopt negative mechanism, coping mechanism, increase their reliance on risky survival strategies. Finally, the breakdown of rule of law, in particular in crisis setting, then, whether natural disaster or armed conflict, and the rise of impunity in affected countries and regions has also to be taken into consideration when talking about trafficking in terms of crisis. That was my contribution, my answer. So thank you very much, and I give you back the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And we'll now move to Paris to give the floor to Olivier. Olivier, you are online.
Yeah, just to add something about identification, because we think that this is the first step. If we saw the figures, if we're looking at the figures in the different countries, the number of victims who are identified, official victims, is very, very low. So it's about 20 victims, 30 victims per year for all forms of trafficking. So here there is a very big issue. And like, for instance, like Caritas Liban do now, well, our colleague Sylvie Head, who is also, connecting now with us, they try to implement, with the police border or with some special units, but in order to be multi-task units, to have a list of indicators, and by this way, to identify some victims from children who are in the street, from people who are in the camp, or from other forms of trafficking. So I think this is the first step. There are a lot of needs for sure, but if we don't have this step, it's very hard. And the second point that I want to add is that we don't have a very protective status. Even when it's asylum seekers, it's very hard for the people to be protected in reality. And this point can explain why it's about the roots of the problems, why the exploitation continue even if they are not in war countries. So we understand that it's very hard in a war country to protect those people, but because of their status, and we thought that perhaps to have a status of victim of trafficking can protect them more, it could be a solution too. So it was our input from Caritas. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And just to check, would Geneviève like to come in on the questions?
No, it's okay. We think that this identification requires some criteria that we must work on during the research action. We'll continue to work concretely with partners of Albania, Armenia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, France, Kosovo, Lebanon, and Turkey to have some concrete result about this.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we now, unfortunately, we've had such a rich discussion. We are moving rapidly, very rapidly to the end of our time. I do want to highlight a couple of things I'm seeing in front of me that are very interesting. So just to highlight some of the feedback coming from our participants today. So for example, on the question of root causes and how humanitarian actors should spend their limited resources trying to address the issue, I see a really remarkable number of people emphasizing the importance of trying to address root causes, which I think is an interesting result. And then also on this open response question, again regarding in a situation of limited resources, what measure should be the greatest focus for trying to address human trafficking in current crisis situations. There are a number of interesting and useful responses coming in. I see a particular focus on the issue of awareness raising, or the strategy of awareness raising as a next step, as a priority. So thanks very much for all of that input. Now we're going to go once more around our panel before we close the event, and apologies we're going slightly over time, but I would like to ensure that each one of our guests today has a few seconds, 30 seconds, to provide us with some closing remarks, ideally some forward-looking remarks regarding what happens next for each of them and their organizations on this question and in this effort. And for the closing remarks, we will be changing the order. So we will be going in the following order: Sarah, Agnes, Olivier, Geneviève, and then Lauren. So now giving the floor over to you, Sarah.
So yeah, really thank you once again. Final concluding remark, we've reiterated it a number of times, but to ensure that trafficking cases aren't overlooked or that there aren't missed opportunities for prevention and the need for minimum standards to be operationalized and fully integrated before, during, and after a crisis to combat human trafficking and to prevent the onward exploitation of vulnerable populations caught up in crises. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And Agnes.
Yes, thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to stress the fact that trafficking in person in terms of crisis is still very under-documented, and that efforts should also concentrate on the documentation of this phenomenon in the field. So that will be it from my side. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Thanks both for being with us. And now moving again to Paris, Olivier, for your brief closing remarks.
Yes, the next step for this research is to try to make some experimentation, and so we start some experimentation to try to fight against this vulnerability. So, for instance, in Armenia, it will be to try to work for economical business running by migrants from, Syria, war in Armenia, and also in Bosnia and Lebanon. So we'll try to fight against some those minorities who are vulnerable by different ways. And we will make an assessment of this experimentation and to try after to promote this project who could have an impact directly to the victims, So this is the next step.
And I just want to add that Stella Axi said now on the site, what's about the responsibility of the states? And I think that for me, the conclusion is that we don't must work only in network of NGO, but we must work a lot with states, and states must take the responsibilities in this issue.
Excellent. Thank you. And to Lawrence, giving you the floor.
I would just conclude by saying that we need to be inclusive. The inclusiveness is the key response. In other words, how we should link humanitarian actors and development actors that should walk hand in hand with their expertise and find the most adequate and complementary responses. In other words, in a situation of crisis, it's important that the humanitarian world has a duty to protect immediately, but then who takes over the protection of victims of trafficking, then that is supposed to move from the humanitarian aspect to a more development field. It's a situation of desperation in desperate situations. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. There are, as we speak, people who are victims of trafficking who are being victimized. So action is truly important as soon as possible. And finally, I would say that it is important. What does not exist so far is the standard operational procedures for counter-trafficking action in crisis, which we are currently started working on. I think it's important to have very clear roles and responsibility in the response in this specific situation, as I said, with an inclusive element, so including all the actors, NGOs, judiciary, and law enforcement.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all of you, Lauren, Sarah, Agnes, Olivier, and Geneviève. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you. And I'd like to just now wrap up with a couple of important points from our side regarding very practical and immediate next steps. So one point is just to say we have had a tremendous number of comments coming in from the participants, and I am very hopeful that in the next steps for the researchers that we've heard from today, but also to the extent that they're bringing these discussions into policy debates and also practical development of practical solutions and responses. I'm confident that all of the inputs that we've received through today's events will be very helpful in those efforts. So I really thank all of our participants for being active with their contributions throughout this hour and a half. We have also received a tremendous number of further questions, and on a variety of very important themes, again, building on the question of responsibility of states. Also, a number of questions we weren't able to get to today, following up on the legal framework and how that's being referred to, whether or not it should be strengthened or linked to other efforts. There are a variety of questions, and we will be trying to address all of these questions using the Q&A feature of the PHAP website. So there will be a space available on the PHAP website where we'll take all of these questions that have come in, and we'll ask our panelists offline to assist us with providing answers. And the responses to all of the questions related specifically to this event will be posted on the event website, on the event page. Also on the event page, you'll find the recording, which will be available very shortly. That will be at the link you see in front of you on the screen. It should be available within the next couple of hours. And then I'll also mention that we have an upcoming consultation on a related theme. This will be another live online briefing and consultation entitled Migrants in Crises. This will take place on Monday, the 29th of June at 4 o'clock Central European Summer Time, and that will be again produced by PHAP and in cooperation with IOM in support of the World Humanitarian Summit consultation process. So I hope that all of you who are with us today will join us again on the 29th for a continuation of a related discussion. So with that, I'll thank again all of my team here as well at PHAP, Marcus, Pedro, Saranjana, and the whole team that has helped on our end to make this possible, and to thank the teams at both Caritas and IOM also for all of their work in putting together the event from their sides. It's been a very an excellent collaboration, and we look forward to next time. So this is Gerard Lang, now signing off from Geneva.